Thanks. Well, thank you all very much. First of all, apologies to anyone who suffered through the panel I was on this morning and now has to listen to me a second time today. And I discovered just now to my horror that, in fact, I'm being graded. So here goes. Pressure's on. It is really a great honor for me to be here, and I want to offer my thanks to three people who are strategically not in the room right now, Joe Tsai, Gary Liu, and Tammy Tan, and the whole team from SCMP. It's fun for me to be back in Hong Kong. This is an ideal place, and this is an ideal time for us to be examining the issues of China, the United States, and global governance. There are few places that have benefited more than Hong Kong from two of the major developments of the era: China's emergence as an economic powerhouse and the globalization of the world economy. And one of the reasons that Hong Kong has been so effective in facilitating China's integration into the international economy is its long-standing status as an international financial center. And that status is based on openness to commerce, foreign investment, its independent and professional legal system, its robust and transparent regulatory regimes, and of course, its open press environment, and its high-quality publications. Did you hear that, Gary? Just saying. Your Excellency, let me pause and recognize Chairman C.H. Tong. His contributions to the U.S.-China relationship and to U.S.-Hong Kong relations are legendary and historic. And his insights are valued on both sides of the Pacific. So it's pretty humbling and daunting for me to be talking about U.S.-China relations in your presence, Chairman. It's a little bit like playing soccer in front of David Beckham. So, but here goes. My point is, not only has Hong Kong done well for itself, but the transparency, the openness, the adherence to the international norms that are a hallmark of Hong Kong have also helped China to navigate and to thrive in the present-day international system. And many of Hong Kong's advantages derive from a one country, two systems framework, which aims to protect the core values of freedom, human rights, democracy, the rule of law, and clean governance. Now, Hong Kong has had to deal with some pressure from within, from without, on the high degree of autonomy accorded by the Basic Law to Hong Kong. So it's important to bear in mind that both elements of Hong Kong's status, the one country part and the two systems part, are essential to sustaining its comparative and competitive advantages. But the broader point is that since the launch of economic reforms in 1978, China, and by extension Hong Kong, have of course benefited immensely from the existing international system. And over time, China has become both a member and a key beneficiary of most international regimes. But China is changing, and changing very, very quickly. And the world and international institutions and regimes have often been slow to adjust. China has sometimes been seen as reluctant to pay its dues, figuratively speaking. China has gone from borrower to lender, from hide and bide to national rejuvenation and the China dream. China has lifted hundreds and hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. China has sent astronauts into space and is preparing to put a man on the moon. The PLA is rapidly modernizing. Its third aircraft carrier is reportedly under construction. And as we've heard today, China is working to transform itself from the world's factory to a center of technological innovation and entrepreneurship and development. So there is a lot for China to be proud of. And there are a lot of expectations for China, a lot of challenges for China. Now, the interdependence of the Chinese and American economies is unprecedented in history. And yet, the complementarity between the Chinese and the American economies, which have benefited both of us and the world, is decreasing. At the same time, competition for 21st century advantage in sectors like AI, robotics, nanotechnology, renewable energy technology, semiconductors, computer engineering, biotech, that's all increasing and increasing fast. So as the economic complementarity of previous decades gradually dissipates, greater stress is being placed on both the bilateral relationship and on the global system. And what that means is that upgraded global governance models are needed to meet these new dynamics. To put it simply, we urgently need to develop models of global governance that allow the US and China to engage in healthy competition while continuing to cooperate on big global challenges, challenges like climate change, global health, terrorism, nonproliferation, in cyberspace, in space, in regional hotspots. As I mentioned, one of the criticisms of the current global governance system is that generally it's been slow to adjust and slow to grant China a voice or a status commensurate with its growing stature. As much as China's benefited from the global governance rules and institutions, as Kissinger has pointed out more than once, China is adjusting to an international system that was developed in its absence through a process that it didn't participate in. So reform is needed for a whole host of reasons. And the international system is under stress also for a whole host of reasons, not just due to China's rise, but also as a function of globalization, automation, AI, information technology. From changes so profound that we are only beginning to grasp their likely impact. That's why I think global governance is approaching a crossroads. For one thing, shifting attitudes in both the United States and in China are contributing to dissatisfaction with the current nature of the global governance system. It's also important to recognize that the sources of US and Chinese discontent about the global system are very different. Today in the US, there's a new and frankly a worrisome skepticism about the benefits from global engagement, global leadership, and even participation in international institutions. Look at the US withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the broader rejection of multilateral trade arrangements. A lot of people are watching with some trepidation to hear what President Trump is going to say when he goes to Davos later this month. Or take the withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement, or the recently released US national security strategy, which seems to downplay American support for universal values in favor of return to America first nationalism. This is part of a broader backlash against globalization. At the same time, today in China, new capabilities and new investments, along with new nationalism, are feeding a more ambitious and a more self-interested global engagement. We're seeing perhaps a little less humility, a little more entitlement, an understandable sense that China's increasing strength entitles it to a greater say or a leading role in international institutions. And this shift in attitudes has also spurred China to push forward with alternative regional institutions, both the Belt and Road Initiative and the Asian Infrastructure Bank can be seen in this light. China has been suspicious of Washington's defense of the status quo, a status quo that locks in U.S. advantages as China sees it. Some in China view U.S. efforts and emphasis on rules of the road as attempts to contain China or to threaten Communist Party control. China has sometimes seen opportunism and hypocrisy in U.S. efforts to use global governance. For example, the insistence that China abide by the terms of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea in the South China Sea when the United States hasn't even ratified the treaty. You can tell that I spent a lot of time talking to Chinese government counterparts. These negative perceptions, the suspicion that global norms and institutions are being used unfairly to undermine Beijing's interests, are exacerbated because, as I said, China is a latecomer to global engagement and is not participating in certain institutions or is underrepresented in them. Now, on the other side of the equation, the United States has been suspicious of what it sees as efforts by China to undermine global institutions or to free ride or to exploit loopholes and protections and to exempt itself from rules and norms. The recent national security strategy I just mentioned bluntly declares that China seeks to displace the United States in Asia and reorder the region in its favor. It argues that past support for China's rise and hopes for China's integration into the post-war international order were a mistake, that China is contesting America's geopolitical advantage and trying to manipulate the international order. Pretty strong stuff. So where does that leave us? I absolutely do not subscribe to the Thucydides trap theory of strategic rivalry, that a conflict between an established power and a rising power is inevitable. But the fact that it's not inevitable doesn't mean that it's impossible. And even Graham Allison says that avoiding the Thucydides trap requires leaders to make good decisions. Exercising good judgment is never going to be more critical than it is today, especially if the U.S. charts a more self-interested, some might say nationalistic foreign policy, and at the same time, China is increasing its global engagement. So to deal with these challenges, both China and the U.S. must find a way to overcome mutual suspicions. Specifically, they need to identify a common interest in building a global governance system that accommodates China's legitimate interests, but also preserves the foundation of a rule-based order that is respectful of universal rights and universal freedoms. Doing this is important. It's essential because the alternative is so dangerous. We face a risk of a shift towards a more zero-sum, a more sort of blood and soil, cutthroat world, a world we don't want to live in. Now, no country can be expected to ignore or to abandon its own interests, but the world can't afford for major powers to neglect their global responsibilities. That means now is the time for both the U.S. and China to check their worst impulses when it comes to global governance. The key here is that the U.S. should not walk away from its leadership responsibilities, and China should seek to ensure that its multilateral efforts complement, not undermine, the existing global governance institutions. It's clear that avoiding a zero-sum world is a project that's going to take a lot of concerted effort in both Washington and Beijing. Are we up to that task? I am the first to admit that there's going to be a lot that the U.S. administration will need to do to show that America first doesn't lead to America alone, and that Washington can meet the challenges that automation, that the knowledge economy pose to U.S. prosperity and to our global leadership. I, for one, think it would be valuable for this president, as President Obama did, and I've heard him say this many, many times in public and in private, make clear that the U.S. welcomes the peaceful rise of a prosperous, stable, and unified China. That is our position, and it's an important one. So there's plenty that the United States should do, but since I'm here in Hong Kong, let me talk a little bit about China. Xi Jinping has set very high expectations at home and abroad. Domestically, he's set ambitious twin centenary goals. Internationally, he's set a high bar in his Davos speech last year and talk about a community of common destiny. President Xi has also set in motion these major international development initiatives. I mentioned the BRI, the AIIB, there's the BRICS Development Bank, there are others. They put China forward as a model and potentially as a leader for the developing world. And to meet these high expectations, China is going to have to make a sustained effort to win and maintain the trust and the confidence of its international partners. I don't think anybody doubts that China has the material capacity to achieve Xi Jinping's ambitious agenda. But there are some big questions that are outstanding. Is China really willing to take on significant responsibility for providing global goods and shouldering international burdens, even if these sometimes go beyond the specific needs of China as a nation? Is Beijing really willing to show restraint, to accept limits and constraints and to abide by international standards, even at the expense of some short-term advantage to China? And while I'm on sensitive ground here, let me raise a point that many of China's friends in the West find particularly troubling. What will be the impact on prospects for regional or global leadership from Beijing's use of technology and big data for repressive political and social controls at home? I ask these as questions, and I ask them with humility because the answers are going to matter a lot. These are prerequisites for other nations' ultimate acceptance of an expanded and sustained Chinese leadership role in global governance over the long term. According to the most recent Pew poll in Asia, and I just read this on the flight over, and it's shocking, the response throughout major countries in this region to the question, how much confidence do you have that the president of China will do the right thing regarding world affairs? The responses were stunningly, worryingly low. I'm talking single digits in many cases. That's a problem. It is important to get those numbers up. And it's my belief that it's really the decisions and the behavior of the Chinese government and Chinese companies that are going to do that, not speeches and white papers and, paid inserts in foreign newspapers. So earlier today, the conference had a very good session on China's highest profile multilateral project, the Belt and Road Initiative. And BRI is a key indicator of whether China's growing international engagement is primarily about satisfying its national interests or whether Beijing seeks to create a more prosperous, interconnected, and win-win Eurasia through multilateral cooperation. Now, some of the skepticism about BRI is unfair. There are some significant cultural differences at play. In the U.S., when a new initiative is rolled out, it's launched with blueprints and handouts and details and specifics and FAQs. That's not the Chinese way. In China, initiatives are presented as broad strategic directives from the political leadership, and the expectation is that the specifics will be worked out gradually and over time. So in a lot of cases, the opacity of new Chinese initiatives is met with skepticism in the West. And the vagueness or the lack of transparency means that people are free to let their suspicions run wild. So that makes BRI something of a Rorschach test of international attitudes towards China. Is BRI about co-opting and coercing China's neighbors? Or is it about promoting connectivity, promoting commerce based on mutual interest and mutual benefit? Is it neo-colonialism, part of a Chinese sphere of influence via state capitalism? Is it a geostrategic play to establish military bases for a blue water navy, establish political leverage through crushing debt? Or is it a sensible, even generous investment of China's excess capital and capacity, a program to build up both China's underdeveloped Western regions, but also to create more dependable supply lines and smoother trade networks to bring its goods to market? Is it a 21st century version of the Marshall Plan that will improve infrastructure and connectivity throughout Asia and benefit everybody? It makes sense for China to work to prove the positive case on BRI. And it makes sense for the United States and other international partners to work to help steer BRI in that direction. And to be successful, I think we all have to remember that there's both a practical component and a moral component to global governance and to leadership. And for BRI, that means first, demonstrating that China can deal successfully with the incredibly complex challenges of managing risk, local politics, the financing, that it can successfully operate in areas that other countries, Russia, India, EU, ASEAN, may well consider their own sphere of influence. That's the practical side of the equation. Secondly, it means that the vision of BRI, where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, connectivity, integration, has to be credible and embraced by other countries, not only by China. It means that also that BRI projects better not be tainted by problems and by scandals. We've already seen in Nepal a $2.5 billion BRI deal for a hydroelectric plant scrapped because the contract was awarded in an extra-legal way. So practical and moral considerations can present a significant challenge. Just yesterday, I read a good editorial, you guessed it, in the South China Morning Post, describing BRI problems in South Asia and urging sensitivity and respect in approaching China's neighbors. So some of this came up in a previous panel, but there are important steps that China can take to avoid these pitfalls and to prove that BRI is a lot more than a geopolitical power play. These include establishing responsible financial, environmental, and labor standards for BRI projects, for ensuring that projects are transparent and inclusive with open and competitive business bidding, clear criteria for project selection, the establishment of anti-corruption standards commensurate with the tough Communist Party standards that it's applying at home. Those would go a long way to demonstrating BRI's credibility. BRI is also an area where we could potentially see a marriage between China's infrastructure development prowess and U.S. strengths in services, in risk management, in financial services, in information technology, and so on. And obviously, it would show to China that it's being inclusive by including foreign companies, manufacturers, and service providers. So I've used BRI as an example of how China can take positive steps to deepen global engagement through new initiatives. These serve as laboratories where China is learning how better to work successfully with foreign partners in an international environment. But at the same time, as I've said, it's really important to avoid undermining the existing regional and global institutions that have widespread international support. My friend and colleague, Kevin Rudd, who sends his warm regards, Chairman, the former Prime Minister of Australia, recently made some important points on this topic at a speech in Beijing University. He was building out the recommendations in an Asia Society report on preserving the long peace in Asia. First, that institutions should play a binding role, drawing states to greater convergence around shared interests. Second, that institutions should seek to mitigate historical distrust. Third, that institutions can facilitate better management of crises and disputes. And fourth, that the institutions should develop the capacity to set forward-looking agendas to deal with future challenges. These are good principles to be guided by. It's also a reminder that there are preventive and progressive rationales for good global governance. And the US and China can work together to improve them, not only to prevent problems, but also to make progress on shared global agendas. To do this, as I've said, the US and China have to manage the differences in perspective and the mutual suspicions that have hampered our efforts in the past. Let me give you an example of a domain that's grievously in need of global norms: cyberspace. This is a void that needs to be filled, but the US and China differ even on the definition of the problem, let alone the solution. Is the goal to protect cross-border information flow or to block it? Is the goal a free and open internet or cyber sovereignty and data localization? For the US, cybersecurity doesn't include control of content. For China, controlling content's kind of the whole point. So it's no easy matter for the US and China to find common ground sufficient to forge international consensus on cyber norms. Hey, cyberspace is a tough issue, but it's an important example that reminds us that strong institutions and international arrangements, which are valuable in their own right, not only depend on US-China cooperation, but serve as a hedge against strategic rivalry. And let's make sure that we grasp the distinction between healthy competition, which tends to bring out the best in both of us, with strategic rivalry, which tends to bring out the worst. No country benefits from strategic rivalry. So my own career in government, my service at the UN and all the work that I did with President Obama and other officials have taught me this. Global governance is not an abstraction. Safeguarding cyberspace, sustaining the ocean's resources, preventing macroeconomic instability and financial upheaval, promoting trade and investment, dealing with global health crises and pandemics, slowing and mitigating climate change, countering WMD proliferation, combating terrorism, combating piracy. These are not abstractions, and good global governance won't occur on its own. The US and China and the community of nations need to work in multilateral forums and need to work on multilateral instruments, both to prevent a dangerous future and to build a better one. Thank you very much.